Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Gray's Kokon. Let's get into the video. And today we're going to be asking the question, what if Harry Truman never became President of the United States? Now, if you wanted to come on this channel to watch a whole long talk about Harry Truman's life, you came to the wrong place. What I can suggest you to check out though is to go on to the channel Biographics. They do a very detailed description of his entire life as well as many other very famous people. So definitely check out that channel if you want an in-depth thing of Harry Truman's life. For this video, we're going to spend most of the time not focusing so much on Harry Truman, but we're going to focus more on someone you probably never heard of before, but someone who came very, very close to being president instead of him. And that person is Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the vice president from 1941 up until 1945. This was during the time when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so FDR, he was president from 1933 until 1945. He led America through the Great Depression and he also led them through World War II, or the vast majority of it. Now, he died in February of 1945. And as is practice within the American system, the person who succeeded him was his vice president. However, what had happened in 1944 meant that this was fundamentally changed. So every 4 years in America, they obviously have elections, and every 4 years, the parties, they will decide who they're going to have on the ballot. The Democratic Party, which was the reigning kind of party at the time, they had a choice of who they wanted for president, and it seemed quite obvious that while FDR had served a third term, which was already unprecedented. The 1940 election was already a very contentious thing because the precedent that had been set since the days of George Washington had always been that presidents served 2 terms or 8 years and that was it. And he had already broken that precedent by running in 1940. Add on top of that, it was 1944. So, if he'd served out his full term, he would have done 4 full terms. And it was a thing where it's this guy's now going to be 16 years in the White House, right? That's far too. That's double what anyone else has done. It was only because of World War II and because it was a thing of well, the war was almost over. We may as well see out FDR. He's been a decent president. Multiple people kind of from both left and right highly admired him. And actually, when he died, you can see the public mourning that took place from coast to coast, and people. It was a genuine, deeply held thing, right? He was elected. However, what didn't end up happening was that his vice president of 4 years was not re-elected. In the Democratic National Convention of 1944, by a very, very narrow vote, it was decided that even though Henry Wallace was the most popular person within the Democratic Party to take over after FDR, according to a Gallup poll, even though he'd received a lot of notoriety from his famous speech in 1942, known as the century of the common man, where he talks about how the 20th century was going to be the century in which the common man, the ordinary folks, they were going to be given an actual state that was going to actually look out for their interests rather than the interest of the very tiny elite. The problem with this is exactly in that, because what he was advocating for, nationalised healthcare system, so NHS, similar to what you have in Britain, the nationalisation of railways, nationalisation of utilities, nationalisation of many banks, and he was advocating for desegregation. Now, all those things, some people obviously, especially on the left, well, obviously, hopefully we're all in agreement about the desegregation thing, right? For most people on the left, they would be like, oh, okay, that sounds okay, what's the big deal with that? The problem is that most people in America, and particularly most politicians in America, were not in favour of that. That's why, for instance, on the healthcare thing, that's why even now in 2021, America doesn't have a universal healthcare system, because obviously there's many competing interests, and there's always this fear of it going towards a socialized medicine, and they don't want a kind of top-down kind of system where the government decides who your doctor is and what kind of medical care you can get and when. Because of all that and many other things, it was a thing of he had very, very powerful people in the Democratic Party who were very hostile to him. Now, What we have to understand is that the different parties were very different then as in comparison to what they are now. Now we kind of think of the Democratic Party as the Liberal Party and the Republican Party as broadly the Conservative Party. Now this is quite a recent phenomenon because for most of US history, it's quite difficult to get our head around it really, because if you're voting for a party and you're like, well, what's its platform? Well, its platform's this, but it's got things that are liberal and conservative and moderate and so it's like, okay, and both parties are broadly similar, but there's some differences, and it's like, well, who am I voting for election then? Like, if I'm a liberal, who am I voting for? Democrats or Republicans? That's kind of confusing, right? And same thing for conservatives. Now, within the House of Congress in these years, the dominant force was the Democrat. Now, the Democrats were split, and the dominant force within that split were the Southern Democrats, was the Dixiecrats as such. These were known as very conservative politicians. They argued for states' rights, they argued for a small government, they argued against that kind of like federal interference and things, and they argued for like the continuation of Jim Crow. Again, linked with states' rights, it's up to the individual states to decide what they want, not the federal government. They had an alliance informally known as the Conservative Coalition, which was a big chunk of the Democratic Party and some conservatives within the Republican Party, and these lot came together mainly because it wasn't so much the segregation thing, that was pretty much just the Dixiecrats who were like really hot on that. For the most part, it was in opposition to FDR's New Deal. So the New Deal, that was obviously state intervention in the economy, that was taxing people a lot, spending a lot to try and get them out of the depression. This was a centralization of government, whereas America had always before been a lot more laissez-faire, a lot more like hands-off, and a lot more down to like state governments, whereas this was a very much a departure from what the norm had always been. And many conservatives in both the Democratic and Republican Party were staunchly against FDR and his agenda. And we got someone like Henry Wallace, who's even further to the left than FDR. Well, actually, I just realised further to the left because this is my left and that's your left, but whatever. So for the sake of you guys, further to the left. Yeah, so he's way off there somewhere. Anyway, he wanted to put in all these policies, and it's a thing where they obviously not going to vote for it, because even in our timeline, Harry Truman, when he became president, he wanted to push through something known as the Fair Deal. This was even struck down. So this is somewhere in between what Henry Wallace was arguing for and what FDR was arguing for. So it's kind of what you can think of as what later inspired LBJ in the 60s with the Great Society. So a lot more state intervention, a lot more from like the federal government intervention. But at the same time, even that wasn't able to be passed in the late 40s. So as a result of this, within the Democratic Party of 1944, there was almost a conspiracy as such, where the delegates within that convention decided, actually, we don't want to elect this man. FDR, we recognise he's very sick and he's very old and he could die at any moment, and we don't want this guy to be one heartbeat away from the president, so we're going to pick a safer bet. And the safer bet that they picked, he was a rather insignificant man from Missouri, and this was Harry Truman. So he'd been the senator. If you look at his life story, it was very uneventful up until the point at which he became the vice president. All of a sudden, when he became the vice president, within a few months, FDR died and he ended up taking over as the president. So the effect that Harry Truman had, especially within that first term as president, is so huge, it literally does take books to cover it. What you have to recognise is that, first of all, one of the major acts that he ended up doing when he became president is the dropping of the atomic bomb. So he oversaw the defeat of Germany, oversaw the defeat of Japan, and he set the world up for the Cold War, because the Soviets were obviously expanding. After they already conquered Nazi Germany and liberated Eastern Europe, they then put Eastern Europe in their back pocket, and the threat of communism spreading throughout the rest of the world. This is something which Harry Truman was one of the first people to actually notice, all the way back at the Potsdam conference. If you compare how FDR handled Stalin and Molotov, like his foreign minister, to how Truman handled it, from the very beginning, because of Truman's anti-communist stance here, he was very suspicious of the Soviets. When, for instance, Churchill in 1946 spoke in front of the president and said, "There's an iron curtain that has descended across the continent of Europe." This really helped to prompt where Harry Truman was already planning on taking things. He already wanted to contain communism and to stop it spreading into other countries. And this is what led to the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine sets the stage for what happens in the rest of the Cold War. America's foreign policy for the rest of the Cold War is that any country that is at risk of going communist is going to be aided, it's going to be armed, and if need be, troops are going to be sent in to stop it from going communist. And this was something which Harry Truman was at the absolute apex of pushing. Okay, so you might ask, surely Truman couldn't have been that different, like kind of compared to Wallace. Like, surely any US president in the post-war world would have like done something against like the obvious expansion of communism around the world. No, no. Like, so if we look at Henry Wallace, how do we put it nicely? He was at best incredibly naive. Here's some examples. Upon visiting the Soviet Union and visiting the Gulag system, he was told by Soviet officials there that the prisoners were volunteers. Now, anyone with any kind of common sense would recognize that actually people working almost to death, or in many cases working to death, in the middle of freezing Siberian winter, they're not volunteering. Why would you volunteer for that? But his response was classic. He said that the volunteers in these gulags, the volunteers, he said that the Gulag system was a mixture between the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is basically like a big New Deal policy to give hydroelectric power to many places in the South. He said that it was a mixture between the TVA and the Hudson Bay companies. You'd have to be incredibly naive to not recognize this. This is the equivalent of like the actual like kind of Nazi death camps, okay? This was serious stuff, yeah. Like 20 million people died in the Soviet Union. Not all of them in the gulags, but many people were sent there by Stalin, and these people were either executed or froze to death or starved to death or worked to death, etc., or tortured, everything. Like, it was terrible. So he completely went, ooh, didn't understand what all that was about. He also was very naive in the sense of like, well, all the countries in Eastern Europe after the war were overthrown one by one by the communists, yeah. But the last one, and one of the most obvious, egregious ones, where it was just clear cut, like, this is clearly a communist coup, was Czechoslovakia in 1948. His response was like, oh, well, what's the big deal? And actually, this was in line with what he had said in a very famous speech 2 years before. Truman took him on into cabinet, and he ended up making an impromptu speech in front of a group of people who, many of them were Marxists themselves, yeah, they were communists, right? He got booed for this speech, but there's nowhere compared to how much he was about to get booed for. So within this speech, he said that the USA had no more business in what the Soviets did in Eastern Europe than the Soviets would have interest in what America did in Latin America. Now, this was booed by the communist audience there because it implied that the Soviets shouldn't have any kind of say in what happened in Latin America. So obviously they were pro-Stalinist, and they wanted like kind of, yeah, they wanted the whole world to kind of be taken over by communism. How the rest of the country responded to that speech was, hold on, what? This guy who's in our government, yeah, says that it's fine basically for the Soviets to have a free hand in Eastern Europe and to take over the countries there and to have them under occupation essentially, and and no free elections, like complete like Stalinist dictatorships installed in all these countries. Yeah, that's completely fine. We've got no business on there. You can understand from a foreign policy perspective just how naive he was. Never mind the fact that in the 1940s you had the Greek Civil War, which was actually one of the main catalysts for the Truman Doctrine, because Harry Truman, like in the middle of this Greek Civil War where the communists were fighting the royalists, Britain ended up pulling out because they couldn't afford to keep keeping the troops there. So Harry Truman said, actually, we're going to send arms, we're going to send money to prop up like the anti-communists there, and we're going to fight against communists. That's part of what spurred on the Truman Doctrine. If we see how Henry Wallace reacted in all of these other crises, we can see very clearly that actually he wouldn't have stepped in, because 1946 was when the Truman Doctrine was first laid out, and 1946 is when he made this speech basically saying it's none of our business what happens in Eastern Europe. And never mind as well, what else is little known, which is that France and Italy, because they had very, very large communist parties after the war, in both those countries, there was a high probability that they could, in an election, go communist. If Italy and France went communist, then that puts the rest of Western Europe in peril then, because West Germany would then be completely surrounded by communist powers, and also the Benelux countries as well would be threatened. Because it was such a big thing, the CIA under Truman put lots of money into campaigns for different anti-communist parties in both France and Italy, and as a result of some of this additional funding, these anti-communist parties were able to narrowly win in those elections, and to keep the communists out of power. If there hadn't been this impetus, by Truman to oppose communism, there's every chance that France and Italy could have fallen to communism. And then if that happened, then the rest of Europe would probably have fallen sooner or later. So this would have been not very well received, to put it very lightly. In our own timeline, we had something called McCarthyism, which was directed against many people in America who were seen as either communist or fellow travelers of communists, i.e. communist sympathizers. Henry Wallace was deemed as to be one of these sympathizers, because he clearly was quite happy to have lots of policies which were quite in keeping with the communists, and he himself didn't recognize what the Soviets were doing and what actual threat of communism there was. In a real world scenario, Harry Truman narrowly won the 1948 election. It was so close, the press the day before called the election and said that Dewey, the Republican candidate, was going to win the election. So they tried to preempt it by printing out the stories and be like, Dewey's won, and so there's Truman there celebrating, being like, haha, obviously I won. That was very narrow in this time. Never mind if France and Italy and Greece had fallen to communism, he wouldn't have been re-elected. In America, you would have had McCarthyism on steroids. It was really pretty hyped up during the late 40s and early 50s, with people being very wary of so-called Reds under the bed, of communists in the State Department, of communists in Hollywood, communists in music and art and everywhere. This would have been ramped up even more if the whole of Western Europe basically went communist. So what about his domestic agenda? Well, a lot of people said that the policy goals of Henry Wallace were very good, they would have been very progressive, and he said that America would have had a lot more social justice if this had been done. However, what we have to understand is that this conservative coalition, which we spoke of before, dominated Congress from 1937 up until 1963. And as I said earlier, they were able to stop Harry Truman's Fair Deal, which is a very, very watered down version of all of this. So not only would you have had embarrassment on an international level, people already talking about how the Democrats have dropped the ball in 1949 with the loss of China, China going communist. If all of Western Europe had also gone communist, this would have been absolutely massive. And so as a result of that, people would have hated Henry Wallace for his foreign policy, and on a domestic policy, whether you agreed with the policy or not, there is no way this conservative coalition who dominated Congress would have allowed any of his agenda to have gone through. So he would have been a terrible president in terms of foreign policy. If your countries opponents end up having a stronger hand and you end up having a weaker hand, then that means that you've done a bad job in terms of foreign policy. The point of foreign policy is to keep your enemies at bay, and for you to be able to at least maintain, if not expand, one's own influence. And especially in terms of liberal democratic values, these values would have ended up retreating in many places in Western Europe. So there would have been the twin thing of his foreign policy being seen as the disaster, and his domestic policy being, he would have been seen as a complete lame duck president. So as a result, if Henry Wallace had become the president instead of Harry Truman, I think we can imagine a very, very different America. It took a lot for JFK even in 1960 to be elected, and that was because he ran hard as a very fervent Cold War warrior, and a very fervent I'm a liberal but also I'm very tough on this, I'm pro-defense, I'm pro states' rights, I'm pro this, I'm pro balanced budgets, all this kind of stuff, right? So he sounded very much like a conservative, even though he was a liberal on many things, and that was the only way that he was able to be elected in 1960. The damage would have been so huge. I don't see a Democratic president anytime before at least the late 60s, if not the 1970s. And then add to this Henry Wallace was widely criticised by the fact that he knew obviously about the Manhattan Project, which was like the project for America to get nuclear weapons. He offered to give these nuclear weapons up to an international body. He wanted to spread it around so that the whole world would have access to like how to make nuclear weapons. When in the Manhattan Project, in our own like timeline, we had Soviet spies spying in on it, and that's how they were able to, in 1949, get the bomb. If it had just been given to the rest of the world, yeah, the Soviets would have had it as early as probably 1946, if not earlier. So again, this would have been another thing which would have gone against America's interest. Henry Wallace would have been seen as the person who lost Western Europe to communism. He would have been seen as a lame duck president who wouldn't have got any of his policies enacted, and he would have been seen as the person who gave away the nuclear secret to the Soviets. So with that being said, hope you enjoyed this video, but if you really like this, then hit the like button. We're trying to go for 20 likes per video now, because that obviously boost the algorithm. It means that more people end up watching this channel, which means that more people will end up learning from things. And also as well, hit me up in the comment section, share it with your friends. Let people be engaged with these videos, let people like actually watch these videos. And like, I want to hear some feedback. I want to hear like what I'm doing well, what I'm doing badly, what points I've missed, because obviously with these alternative history ones in particular, there's so many different things that even if I was here for an hour, there'd still be things that one would miss. Definitely hit me up. And before I forget, don't forget to stay tuned for our next video, which will be out on Sunday. So that's going to be on what if Hitler never declared war on the US. So on the 11th of December 1941, Hitler ended up declaring war on the USA. This dragged America straight into the European war. So we're going to look into some of the stats on that. We're going to look at some of the events that were happening at the time, and we're going to look at what might have happened, how might the war have gone differently if America hadn't been involved in the European theatre. So with that being said, have a great day and bye.